Welcome to NCSA 2020 Virtual.
Thank you all for subscribing to the 2020 NCSA Virtual Conference. My name is Bob Crothers. I'm the NCSA President, and I have the honor today of introducing our Useem Plenary speaker, Dr. Rashawn Ray. Dr. Ray is an Associate Professor and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is also one of the co-editors of the ASA publication Context Magazine's Sociology for the Public. Dr. Ray's research addresses the mechanism that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Ray has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, and 15 op-eds. His articles have appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, Science Advances, Social Science Research, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Du Bois Review, and the Annual Review of Public Health. Recently, Ray published a book, How Families Matter, Simply Complicated Intersections of Race, Gender, and Work, with Pamela Brayboy Jackson, and another edition of Race and Ethnic Relations in the 21st Century, History, Theory, Institutions, and Policy, which has been adopted 40 times for college courses. Ray has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, Huffington Post, NBC News, The Conversation, Public Radio International. Ray has appeared on NPR, C-SPAN, MSNBC, HLN, Al Jazeera, Indus.News, and Fox. His research is cited in CNN, The Washington Post, Associated Press, MSN, The Root, and The Chronicle. Relatedly, Ray has agreed to sit on a panel in this conference working with the media, entitled Sociologists in the Spotlight, Strategies and Pitfalls for Interacting with the Media, which is available as part of this virtual conference. Previously, Ray served on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington Planning Committee and the Commission on Racial Justice with Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Ray is currently on sabbatical, working at the Brookings Institute as a David M. Rubenstein Fellow. He recently testified before Congress on the importance of collecting demographic data for entrepreneurs and investors. He has graciously agreed to build the NCSA into his sabbatical and has stayed with us through the upheaval of the past month, for which we are all very grateful. His presentation today is titled Forming a Racially Inclusive Sociological Imagination, Becoming a Racial Equity Learner, Advocate, and Broker. It's our honor to have him address the NCSA meetings in this unique format as the Ruth and John Useem Plenary Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rashawn Ray.
Dr. Carruthers, thank you for having me. I am honored to be giving this lecture, particularly in this moment at this time. I think the uniqueness that you all went through to put this together should be applauded and actually replicated in other spaces. I also definitely want to thank Joyce, her organizational skills, administrative skills, the way that she brought all of this together has just been remarkable. And so again, I'm honored to be here. Wish that I could have been in Cleveland directly giving this, but given this is what we're gonna do. So what I'm gonna aim to do over the next 45 minutes or so is to give my lecture, share the PowerPoint, and kind of narrate through what's going on here. Okay. I think that we are good to go. Making sure from Bob we can see it. Awesome. So I want to get right into it. We know that a few years ago, when the American Sociological Association conference occurred, simultaneously there was a United the Right rally, white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. We also know that a few months before that, on the campus of the University of Maryland, that Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III was murdered in a hate crime by a University of Maryland student, Sean Urbanski. Part of thinking through this is in this context, in the past few years, we've seen a huge rise in hate crimes. Of course, one of the biggest ones is what happened in South Carolina at Mother Emanuel AME Church, where Dylan Ruth killed nine parishioners after they had invited him in and he had fellowshiped with them. One thing we know is that hate groups have significantly increased over the past 20 years. And this rise has coincided in various ways with different things that have occurred in the United States, particularly with the election of President Barack Obama as the first Black identifying president. In 2018, the number of hate groups once again went over 1,000, and we're continuing to see that rise currently. When it comes to the motivated bias for hate crimes, what we see is that overwhelmingly, the bias and the direction of the discrimination is based on race. It's also based on religion, also based on sexual orientation. But overwhelmingly, about 60% of hate crimes that are reported end up being based on race. And who commits these crimes? Well, based on a report from the Anti-Defamation League, what we see is that about 70% of the total deaths as it relates to domestic terrorism, meaning where there is terror based in the United States, a hate crime where someone is killed and murdered as the ability to enact fear on a larger group of people, we see that overwhelmingly these cases are committed by right-wing extremists. And about 75% of all of these cases are committed by white nationalists and white supremacists. So we see in this regard that white supremacy and white nationalism is unfortunately alive and well in the United States and around the world. And we know that this coincided as well with the 2016 election of Donald Trump. In places where Donald Trump campaigned, hate crimes increased over 200% in those locations. And we continue to see these patterns to this day. General John Allen, who is a four-star general who presided over some of the wars in the Middle East, who is currently the president of the Brookings Institution, where I'm on sabbatical at, he recently released a report from the Department of Homeland Security and testified on Capitol Hill. And he noted that white nationalism and white supremacy is one of the biggest threats to our democracy and to equality in the United States. We also know, however, that racism and discrimination isn't solely just related to hate crimes or simply related to people who consider themselves to be white supremacists. We see that discrimination and bias and hate also transfers to the public spaces that we're in, whether this be oftentimes white people profiling and discriminating against Black people in public settings like pools, at parks, in other places, such as even university campuses where students might be sleeping in dormitories where they've paid money to stay at, and even with politicians such as Ralph Northam's now infamous kind of white supremacist and blackface image that we see from his medical school days. Of course, Governor Northam is the governor of Virginia. Even in the state of Maryland, where I am, there was a state delegate who used the N-word to describe Prince George's County, which happens to be the county that I live in. It's the predominantly Black, most affluent African-American county in the United States. So one of the big things to note is that socioeconomic status and social class does not remove people from being impacted by discrimination and racism. And at times it might actually exacerbate it as it relates to some of the spaces that people are in. We also see that this transfers to education as well. If we look at preschool suspensions, one of the biggest things that we see is one of these lines does not look like the other when we look at the orange lines. This is showing preschool suspensions by racial composition. The gray lines show the percentage of each group in preschool. Whites have the highest number in preschool at 43%. Latinos is 29%, and African Americans represent slightly under 20%. But when we look at that orange bar, we see that even though Black kids represent less than 20% of all kids in preschool, they represent 40%, 42% of all of the kids who are suspended from preschool. And I want to put this in a particular context. See, we're talking about preschool, 2 to 5-year-olds. Now I have 2 kids, and I think about this. Now they're older now, but I think about what were they doing when they were 2 to 5 years old? They were doing normal types of things. They were jumping around, they were playing, they were crying, they were eating, they were running around, they would get into it with somebody, normal kid-like acts. So the fact that we are even suspending preschoolers, and the fact that in some jurisdictions they even have to implement laws to say that if you're under a certain age, say under 10 years old, that you should not be able to be arrested and handcuffed, speaks to the ways that we are living in a criminalized state. And this criminalization, of course, is magnified by the way that race and racism operate in the United States. But see, this is what's key. For a lot of people, they say, well, maybe those kids are just bad. I mean, kids do things they shouldn't do. Maybe they need to be arrested. Maybe they don't need to be on the street. This is what I love about research. This was a study that actually I built a lot of the work that we've been doing in the Lab for Applied Social Science Research using virtual reality work. What this particular study did was they took teachers. They gave them glasses like I have on now, and they put little trackers on them, eye trackers on them. And they were able to see down to the millisecond who and what teachers were looking at in class. And there were observers in these classrooms. And what they found, that no matter what was happening in class, a teacher would turn around and they primarily did two things. First, they primarily looked at boys. So you can see that overwhelmingly about about 3/4 of the time, teachers looked at boys. But then we see that overwhelmingly, teachers looked at Black boys. And again, we have to put this in context that Black children in these preschools were highly underrepresented overall when it comes to the share of the number of kids in preschool. So we're talking about less than 9% of all of the kids in these spaces were Black boys. But yet and still, Black boys represented 42% of the times when teachers looked at them. The observers found that no matter what the kids were doing, they were behaving in similar ways. It was the boys, in particular the Black boys, who got in trouble for that. We also see that this transfers to healthcare. One of the biggest outcomes when we talk about race that we cannot dismiss and has to be addressed deals with maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates for Black mothers. As you see in the graph on the bottom, overwhelmingly, Black mothers experience very high rates of maternal mortality relative to white women and relative to women of other racial groups. And again, socioeconomic status does not absolve Black women from this. As you see at the top, Serena Williams reported that she almost died after giving birth after nurses and other healthcare providers, physicians, did not believe her when she said she was in pain. Beyonce and other Black women have had similar stories. So we can imagine what the experience is for Black women who aren't famous, for Black women who don't have money, in supposedly the wealthiest space in the country, when unfortunately, not only are we in the wealthiest country around the world, but we are also in one of the most unequal and inequitable countries in the world. And we are obviously seeing this as it relates to COVID-19, which I'll say something about in a second. This was a study that looked at the racial empathy gap, looked at it across different groups. You see, there were 5 different experiments in this study. They focused on students, they focused on everyday people, they focused on healthcare providers, and they focused on first responders like police officers and firefighters. And what they found, that no matter which group they sampled, what they found was there was a racial empathy gap. What I mean by that is what you had was, say for instance, someone says, like oftentimes when you're injured, particularly this happens when women are giving birth, they say on a scale from 1 to 10, how bad is your pain? And if a person says 8, then supposedly, objectively, they're supposed to administer a certain amount of medication. If a person says 5, a different dose. If they say 2, less than that. What they found was that across these groups, when Black people and white people said that they had the same pain threshold, that all of these groups recommended administering less pain medication to Black patients relative to white patients. So we see how these sort of things play out as it relates to racial bias, as it relates to discrimination, and really the fact that although we focus on, and I started this lecture by talking about hate groups and hate crimes, one thing that's very important to recognize is that race and racism is socialized in all of us. And hate groups have now infiltrated, more so, spaces, particularly predominantly white spaces, where people are interacting and having just everyday conversations. And it starts to shift the way people feel about different people, what people think about different people, and then it starts to impact their behavior. We're seeing this particularly right now as it relates to COVID-19 and the coronavirus. These are data that recently came out on race across 4 states, Michigan, Illinois, North Carolina, South Carolina. And what you see in blue is the percentage of Blacks based on their percentage of the state population. In red, what you're seeing is the percentage of people who have been diagnosed with COVID-19 in those states. In all of these states collectively, Blacks are overrepresented when it comes to diagnoses versus their state population by 74%. 74%. And this is going to get worse as it starts to hit the Deep South, as we start to get data from Louisiana, as we start to get data from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, and across the country. So we're seeing the ways that race and racism impacts different groups relative to others. Of course, something that I've done a lot of work on over the past several years is policing. For the past several years, I've done extensive research with my colleagues in the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, and we collected a host of data. Not only do we have observational data from ride-alongs, from police meetings, from community group meetings, etc. We also have data from surveys of police officers in the public, and we have interview data, extensive interview data from about 200 police officers and over 100 residents in local areas around the country. We also have data, experimental data, from police officers in different departments around the country who came to partake in our virtual reality training simulation that we helped to build with Google Jigsaw. And I'll talk about that in a second. But when it comes to policing and the racial bias that's embedded in it, a report came out from the FBI a few years ago and warned that white supremacists were actively trying to get into law enforcement, even more so than they already had. And there are just certain groups that people have to look at, such as the Emerald Society, which was founded in 1952 in Boston. And it was made up of Irish firefighters and police officers, has very racial tendencies in those particular groups. And we see a formalization of white supremacist groups such as the Base and Anton Waffen, who are now infiltrating our law enforcement. And we're seeing the way these sort of things are playing out. One thing we know about policing is that justifiable homicides, and it's key to note what justifiable homicides means. Justifiable homicides are when a police officer kills a person while the police officer is in a line of duty, and they kill a person who either has a felony or is perceived as committing a felony. Overwhelmingly, when these particular incidents happen, police officers are absolved of all blame and culpability. Rarely is a police officer brought to trial, and even more rarely is a police officer actually convicted of this. So some of the ones that have been in the media recently really doesn't capture the full gamut of what's going on. And when you look at this graph, one of the things you see is that over the past 20 years, justifiable homicides have increased over 25% in the United States. One of the other things we know is that it's not really related to crime. Crime has pretty much been decreasing besides a blip over the past 5 years or so, which makes sense. We're in the middle of a movement, obviously, the movement for Black Lives, which has precipitated this, as well as the Women's March movement, as well as gun rights movements and climate change. And when those sort of things happen, we see some blips when it comes to violent crime. But overall, if we look at from the early 90s, violent crime has significantly decreased. So the increase in justifiable homicides is not related to violent crime. One of the other things we know is that similar to other outcomes, there's a huge racial disparity here. I'll just give you the simple byline. Black Americans are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by the police when they are not attacking, nor when they have a weapon. We see that on that bottom row. Who do we get this information from? We get it from police officers themselves. These data come from FBI reports that come from state agencies that's reported to the federal government. Now, what's key about this is we only have these data from 16 states. And of course, there are others, Washington Post and The Guardian, that are compiling more data. But when it comes to federal data, we only have data from 16 states. This means we know how many people get the flu every year. Now, with COVID-19 under Trump, we don't necessarily know how many people really have COVID-19. But overall, the CDC collects data on these particular things. We also know how many people are killed by jellyfish every year, but we don't know how many people are killed by the police. I think that's a travesty. But it's not solely about police officers and law enforcement agencies not wanting to report that. Again, I've done a lot of work in this area, and some of them also want these data. Some don't, but a lot do, because it helps them to perform their jobs better, and most of them are really trying to do that. Part of what this is about is a lack of infrastructure and a segmentation between the federal government, states, and local jurisdictions. Local jurisdictions, most police departments aren't like large police departments that we've been working with, or even mid-sized police departments. And we've worked with large, mid-sized, and small. These small police departments are They're like In the Heat of the Night. If anybody remembers from the 80s, watching In the Heat of the Night, I used to watch it with my granddad all the time. In the Heat of the Night and Matlock. Those are the shows I used to watch, my favorite shows. In the Heat of the Night is it shows a very small police department in the South. And part of what you know is that they simply don't have the resources to do a lot of the things we're talking about. So it's going to take federal oversight and policy to come in to provide resources for the collection of some of the data that we know are extremely important. Some of the other work we've done is looking at implicit association tests. One of the big things we know from these implicit association tests, we gave these tests to police officers. And what you're seeing on the screen is not a mistake. Overwhelmingly, the police officers reported a bias for Blacks with weapons and not a bias for whites with weapons. This means when you hear a police officer say, oh, I thought he had a gun. I thought she was armed. In their head at that moment, based on how implicit bias and racism operates, they did see something. Doesn't necessarily mean it was a weapon, because oftentimes what happens here is that Blackness becomes weaponized. And that's one of the biggest things I've seen. But this racial bias that we see play out in people's implicit attitudes also plays out in their behavior. And what's interesting is the research we've done experimentally, and we'll be publishing upcoming, is that we find that we can explain away explicit bias, but we haven't really been able to explain away implicit bias. It stays there. And I'll get to implicit bias trainings in a second. I do think they can be effective, but I think they're limited. The other thing here to note about the operation of implicit bias and explicit bias is that this bias isn't a white officer thing. It's not a male thing. We had a very diverse group of officers, and we found that the race of the officers simply did not matter, that it is an officer thing. And I further argue it's a person thing. It's a human thing based on the way we are all socialized in the social institutions that I've highlighted: education, work, policing, and criminal justice. And we see it playing out in our everyday lives. So the question is, what do we do about it? What I'll argue is that we have to implement a racial equity framework. What does it mean to implement a racial equity framework? Well, I think first, we need to form a racially inclusive sociological imagination. Of course, as we know from C. Wright Mills, which happens to be the space where my research center is at the University of Maryland, was called the C. Wright Mills Lounge. And one of the things we know from his time at the University of Maryland is that he focused on highlighting what wasn't seen. And so as it relates to race and racism, and of course, Du Bois extended this to have us think about what does it mean to experience a double consciousness. So from a theoretical standpoint, this is building on C. Wright Mills and Du Bois. What I argue is we have to focus less on what race is and more on what race does, how race is used, how it operates through social interactions and institutional conditions to manufacture and maintain racial inequality. We have the Critical Race Initiative at the University of Maryland. We call it CRI. The students do an amazing job. And Dr. Don Dow is currently the director of CRI. And we put on a conference every single year. And at that conference, we really focus on what race does and how it operates. Because see, if we use race and racism, and particularly race as a verb, instead of a noun, we get very different outcomes for what we're looking at. Race isn't simply something to put a variable in a model and control for it and say whether or not there are differences between Blacks and whites and other groups. That's not really what it's about. It's about trying to figure out how race operates. Because see, race operates differently for different groups. If we look at COVID-19 right now, the graph that I just showed across those 4 states that is proliferating across the country, that's highlighting racial differences. We have something like COVID-19, which is an equal opportunity distributor. It is hurting all communities and everyone. And this is one of those types of viruses that really impacted the most affluent among us first. And part of what we see now is that it's going to hit Black communities, brown communities, rural communities, low income communities. I mean, when it starts to spread, when we finally get the numbers, because it's spreading, but when it's spreading throughout rural America in different places around the country, where I went to grad school in Indiana, which gets very rural, in places in the deep South where I grew up in Tennessee and Georgia, we'll start to see kind of very different patterns of how inequality plays out. So here we have an example. COVID-19 is what it is, but the application of that and how it plays out through inequality is what it does. And if we look at New York City, Charles Blow, journalist just had a piece on this where he highlighted that if you look at where the testing places are set up, they aren't in places where people are most likely to get infected. They're in other locations in the city. And now that traffic patterns and transportation has been restricted, it could take people up to an hour longer to get to a testing facility in New York City. That's an urban setting. We haven't even got to rural America yet, where people might not have a hospital that's equipped for 50 miles or so. This is the way we see what race does versus what race is. And part of highlighting this is that it illuminates the ways that race operates, not only as a point of departure to differentiate individuals, as I'm describing this, COVID-19 impacting people, and all of a sudden separates people based on the way that racial inequality plays out in their lives. But it also then leads to different destinations for everyone. What this means is that the death rate for COVID-19 is going to be much higher in Black communities, in low-income communities, in rural communities, than it is in more affluent communities. And unfortunately, we're seeing that play out with COVID-19, where the slogan goes, when America catches a cold, the Black community has already had the flu. And in this case, the Black community has already had COVID-19, as they mostly go to work as what we now consider essential workers who are getting paid $10 on the hour and not getting paid for hazard pay, not getting paid as if they're essential, while people in Washington don't want to pay them a living wage. So this is the sociological inclusive imagination. And part of what I'll argue is that we have to implement a racial equity framework. What I employ to you is to take on three concepts, three different types of identities for racial equity. The first is being a racial equity learner. This is essentially what we've done here, but I think we do this as professors and instructors every single day when we come before students. That is part of our first mission of being public, is interacting with students. And part of this is educating ourselves about the history and legacy of racial inequality in society. We've done that somewhat already. Second is to be a racial equity advocate. This includes holding friends, family members, and coworkers accountable for what they think, say, and do about racism. And I'll get to some specific takeaways about that in a second. Third is to become a racial equity broker. This means advocating for policies and practices that allow for accountability, objective evaluation, and transparency. And see, this is a very, very important point, particularly for sociology as a discipline. As the co-editor of Context Magazine Sociology for the Public with Fabio Rojas, we are very adamant about the fact, and the editors before us, Syed Ali and Philip Cohen, the same way, and before them as well. I mean, all editors of Context kind of think about the ways that sociology is being left behind in certain public spaces. Public spaces being policy and with journalists. We are being left behind in these spaces. And it's unfortunate because we have a lot to contribute, but historically, sociology has got wrapped up in what it means to supposedly do pure science. I've always found that phrase and that concept puzzling, because where I come from, it hasn't necessarily been anything pure about science per se. So what we have to do is take the objective evaluation that we've learned and then say, based on the findings we have, is there some information I can share that can create more equity? And where I come from, I don't have the luxury of just doing science for science sake. What I have to do is speak for people who aren't at the table. And I think that's what becomes extremely key, particularly when we talk about what it means to be an advocate and what it means to be a broker. So when I hear sociologists say we shouldn't do social justice work, I always find that just extremely puzzling, because it suggests that engaging in social justice work means that you aren't being objective. It means that you aren't following the strategies and skill sets that you've learned in graduate school and throughout your career. It suggests some kind of way you're biased. And I think that could be farther from the truth. When I find a finding in policing that Blacks are 3.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than whites, and that there is extreme racial bias on behalf of police officers, and I can go to a meeting with police chiefs and share this information, or go on Capitol Hill and testify about this topic, and I don't do it because that's not pure science, shame on me. And shame on all other sociologists and other academics who think that way. It's an old school way that is actually leading to our discipline as sociology being left behind. Part of this is really highlighting a key example. I mentioned at the beginning about Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III, who was murdered at University of Maryland. Again, he was murdered by a University of Maryland student. But Richard Collins, who's Black, and his murderer, who's white, it goes a little bit deeper than that in Prince George's County. Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins attended Bowie State University, which is a historically Black university in Prince George's County in Maryland. He was set to graduate 2 days later. They actually hold the graduations at the University of Maryland as part of a larger agreement. And, you know, there was a recent HBCU settlement, multi-million-dollar settlement, not even gonna get into that. But the point of talking about this is he was on campus, spending time with friends before graduation. Importantly, he was with a white man and an Asian woman, actually representing what I think a lot of people view as racial progress, of racial diversity. When I see groups that look racially diverse like that, it means that we are progressing into a place. Sean Arbeski came up and disrupted that, telling the Asian woman and the white man to move to the side so he could stab the Black man. Part of what happened at that point, recently, we fast forward a few years, Sean Arbeski was recently found guilty of murder, but he was not found guilty of the hate crime. Because in the state of Maryland, like similarly throughout the United States, hate crime laws mostly read that a person had to commit an act solely based on one of the protected clauses. These protected clauses in groups being about race, religion, sexual orientation, and the like. So Sean Arbeski was not convicted of the hate crime. In fact, the judge threw it out to the dismay of the public and the prosecution. Now, we fast forward a few more months, and I was able to go to the Maryland General Assembly and testify before the State Senate and the House of Delegates with several other people, including Paige Miller, who works with the Critical Race Initiative and works with Context Magazine. She's a PhD student at in the Department of Sociology in Maryland. And we testified on behalf of this bill. And I highlighted some of the work that I did at the beginning on hate crimes. And that bill passed. And why was the Second Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III hate crime bill important? Because it changed the language. It changed the language from motivated completely to motivated in part due to a protected clause. So for sociologists who study attitudes like I do, you know that, I mean, when you run a regression analysis, that no outcome is determined solely by one factor. And so that's the way we set it up statistically. And I took that information and gave that information to policymakers to help them make an informed decision. That's not doing social justice work. That's just doing the work that I should be doing. And it doesn't mean that I'm compromising pure science by doing so. Instead, I think I'm elevating it. So one of the other things we did and kind of how we got here with the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, we developed a virtual reality decision-making program with computer scientists, as well as others who were informing what we were doing. We conducted extensive implicit bias trainings with police officers. This is a way to also share and give. So for several years, we would go in and give these implicit bias trainings. And we are currently still giving them. We have an extensive curriculum. We've done this with the Department of Homeland Security. We do a train-the-trainer course where we have leaders come in from different departments and we train them on taking the information back to their department, which I think is one of the best ways to do it because they're more likely to listen to people who have their experience and are similar to them. And even though I have like 6 police officers in my family, yeah, that works, but they still view me as a race guy. So having one of their own come in and give this information is important. When we developed this program, extensively what we did was we developed a series of virtual reality scenarios. We had a pullover scenario and we had a suspicious person scenario. They vary by race, they vary by gender, they vary by language, they vary by action, as you see on the bottom left. And we developed 90 virtual reality scenarios. And then we got grants to bring in police officers from around the country to our lab at the University of Maryland to go through these scenarios in an experimental fashion, really trying to tease out what factors determine the way that police officers treat people in everyday life. And again, I've already highlighted what we primarily found. We found that, and the other thing we did, we also, I should have mentioned this, we gave them surveys as well. They got at their implicit biases, they took an implicit association test. Then we gave them surveys that picked up on racial resentment and racial sentiments, highlighting the symbolic racism scale and others. And so we have one of the first studies on policing or any outcome where we have implicit attitudes, explicit attitudes, as well as behavior. And so we could control for tons of things under the sun. And we found coming out of these experiments that implicit bias still played a role. This is what it looks like. Dr. Long Dong, this is Sita, who were going through one of our virtual reality scenarios. We could also collect other things. We could collect their heart rate, put heart rate monitors on them to monitor the way that's playing out. We can monitor their stress through speech to figure out how their stress is playing out. We can also measure body movement, and we can track weapons. We can literally record their bodies while they're going through the virtual reality scenarios, and we can transpose that with the virtual reality that they're going through. We put trackers that are like quarter-sized objects on their replica weapons. And then we can also track their eyes, similar to the preschool study that I showed you earlier. Some of the interesting things that have come out of this thus far is that more experienced officers are more controlled. They're more stable. Heart rates are more stable. Stress is more stable. Part of what this means is that we highlight the ways that physiology plays out in policing when people get stressed. One of the other big things we notice is what a lack of sleep and a lack of eating can do. As everybody knows, when you haven't had sleep and you haven't been eating, I mean, you're just irritable. I mean, you just snap on people for no reason. I mean, you just like, hit your laptop because it stalled for a second. I mean, you just say stuff to people, particularly people who are closest to you. Now, imagine if we give you a gun and we see how these kind of things play out. And so this is what's happening with police officers. They are just everyday people like we are, and they are overworked and overstressed. And one of the big things we found is that police officers have extremely poor mental health. There's a study that we're drawing upon, a large data set, that found that about 80% of police officers report chronic stress, and about 1 in 6 report alcoholism and substance abuse, as well as suicidal thoughts. These are some of the outcomes we're seeing as police officers are overworked and overstressed. You combine that with their implicit racial biases, and you set up a recipe for disaster that we see with the rise in justifiable homicides around the United States. So, how do we become a racial equity advocate? What does that mean? I think we really have to juxtapose advocacy and being an advocate with allyship and being an ally. Oftentimes we talk about what it means to be an ally in solidarity with someone, right? That, people are being discriminated against, so I'm going to wear a white pin and let people know that I'm in solidarity. That's great. I think people should wear those pins. I like that kind of stuff. But what's interesting about wearing pins and being an ally is you still have the ability to be silent when you do that. Instead, being an advocate means you actually advocate. You are taking more action. And the way I think about advocacy and being a racial equity advocate in this context is speaking up for people when they are not present. The way I think about this is there are tables around the United States and around the world. Tables are set up. People sit around those tables. They eat at those tables. They meet at those tables. And when I look around the tables, I always think about who's not present, whose voice and literally physical bodies do I need to make manifest in these spaces. And oftentimes what happens is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu and somebody's eating you for lunch, unless somebody at that table becomes an advocate and speaks up for you. I really seen this in Germany when I lived in Germany at Indiana University, where I got my PhD at. We had an exchange program with the University of Mannheim in Germany, and I was fortunate enough to be selected one year, and I went and taught a course, Race and Ethnic Relations in a Globalized Context, to students from like 5 or 6 different countries, and it was an amazing experience. One thing I noticed is when I would sit at tables with Germans, they viewed me as an American. It was fascinating because it was one of the first times my American identity was extremely salient, because in the US context, even as an American, even the grandson of a Purple Heart Bronze Star awardee that served in 2 wars, even the son of a woman that got admitted to West Point. You got to think of a Black woman getting admitted to West Point in the 70s. My mom is a phenomenal person. My American identity wasn't extremely salient, even as an American, because I was always being perceived as being Black or being African American first, instead of just being American. But in Germany, I was viewed as an American. And then second, it was kind of like, oh, okay, you're Black. And at the table, I noticed that these tables we would eat at and fellowship at, that the people who weren't at the table were Turks. Turkish people in Germany represent the largest minority population, and they would be being talked about. And they would tell me where to go and where not to go. And you need to be careful around Turks. And I would say, We just walked down the street. We didn't have any problems over there. And so it became a form of racialization where I had the ability to sit at that table and advocate and speak up for a group of people who were not present at that table. So part of this meant then me being racially competent about a context that I wasn't as familiar with, similar to whites might have to become more racially competent about the US context and the things that happen here. I had to then create respectful work environments for different groups of people and hold people accountable for their treatment of others, which is extremely difficult to do. And the way I think about it, if you can hold your relatives accountable, your mom, your dad, your racist uncle or auntie for saying something, then you can hold anyone accountable. Because one thing my grandfather taught me, who served 21 years in the military, that your silence is your acceptance. So see, those pins and your allyship allows you to be silent. Instead, what I'm advocating for is to be a racial equity advocate and speak up and speak out when you see someone being mistreated, the same way I do as it relates to my research on gender inequality, sexism, and sexual assault, is to speak up for women in spaces that are male dominated, which of course as a man, I happen to be in often. And if I don't speak up and speak out, then those types of narratives are allowed to proliferate about who women are, about how they think, about how their bodies should be used. The same way that Black bodies are used up in predominantly white spaces, that then proliferate white supremacist rhetoric throughout white communities and around the world. So if your table looks like this now, as you're dealing with COVID-19, if your holiday tables look like this, aim to transform those tables. Saying something simple like, yeah, I disagree with that. I know we're going to keep on watching this game, but I'm just letting you know I disagree with that. I don't even want to argue with you right now. We can talk about it later. I just want to let everybody know that I disagree with what you just said. That's actually not right. Instead of just being silent about it. Because when you're silent, people think you accept what's been said. Part of this is creating brave spaces. Oftentimes we talk about creating different types of spaces. We talk about creating spaces where people can come in and be safe. I've always found that concept puzzling. I get it. I get the concept, but I've always found it puzzling from the standpoint that one of the only spaces I've ever felt safe is in my house. And before I bought my house, it was my grandmama's couch. Every other space was not safe to me. There is no college campus in America that's ever been safe for me. The way that Black people are treated in those spaces, in those places, the way that I've been treated in those spaces. Instead, how we need to think about it is creating brave spaces. Part of creating brave spaces means when you go into spaces that are perceived to be safe, be brave and speak up and speak out for people. And other people would notice those kind of things, that you are doing that. And then that's how you really become an ally. So part of this is building bridges. This image that you see here, when I teach race and ethnic relations, one of the first time teaching race at Indiana University, I had a student, it's a fairly large class, maybe like 80 students, who sent this image to me and said, Rashawn, when you lecture on race, this is the image that I think you are trying to convey to us about what society is. And I interpreted this to mean the way that we are all one as humans, that underneath the skin, we are all the same, but we allow something like race, which isn't necessarily real which isn't necessarily real in its circumstances, but is real in its consequences. So in other words, race is real in terms of its impact, not necessarily where it comes from, really racializes people. And how do we transform that racialization process? When it comes to be a racial equity broker, particularly at the workplace, particularly in higher education institutions, particularly in your department, in the organizations you're a part of, you need to have a clearly defined mission, clearly defined competencies and outcomes. This allows things to be more objective. You want to convey the relevancy of diversity to your organization. This isn't about just picking someone because they feel some kind of minority void or some type of, target of opportunity. Instead, it's about saying through this objectivity, we're going to create racial equity on the front end of what this looks like. And through the process in which we're embodying racial equity, the best people will rise to the top. And some of those people will happen to be racial minorities who previously haven't had spots there. Part of this is promoting participation in external diversity organizations, taking steps to recruit and retain employees, being resilient and committed to diversity in changing climates. The implicit bias training program that we use with police officers, I've developed years ago and been using for an extensive period of time with corporations, with business schools and departments and the like. And so part of this is helping people to think through some of this, helping people to think through what impact looks like. Impact looks like assessing employee attrition. workforce satisfaction, external awards and recognition for diversity efforts, and workplace climate satisfaction surveys. And then I think on a large scale, if we really want to, particularly in the United States, to atone for the legacy of slavery and structural racism in America, we will seriously implement a reparations package. Dr. Andre Perry, who's one of my colleagues at Brookings, we recently wrote a piece on reparations, and we highlighted a package. And one of the examples we gave is what universities is doing, like Georgetown, Princeton, and others, who Georgetown, for people who don't know, Georgetown became Georgetown as it was faltering because Washington, D.C. sold 272 slaves, enslaved people in 1838, and built their endowment. That's how Georgetown became Georgetown. That's how a lot of universities became their universities, on the backs of enslaved labor. When we talk about enslaved labor, in 1860, enslaved Black Americans were worth $3 billion, just their physical bodies alone. We haven't even got to the cotton they produced, the railroads they built. And part of this is thinking about this legacy of racism in the United States. See, in the early to mid 1800s is really how we got what we call the Trail of Tears, but we have to be a little bit more deliberate about that. It was America, what had just become America, went through the South, invaded Native American and Indian territories, killed them, maimed them, wiped them out, and pushed them further west. Part of thinking about this is where I happen to live, Washington, right outside of Washington, D.C. And we have a football team here known as the Redskins. What most people don't know about the name Redskins is how the term Redskins came about. Is there were so many Native Americans being killed that you had to bring the bodies in order to get money. So there were bounties on Native Americans' bodies. There started to be so many Native American bodies that they said, well, look, just scalp their heads, bring us the top of their head, and we'll give you the money because we know that you've killed them. That is where the term redskin came from, because it was literally scaling back the top of their head where you could see the red underneath their actual skin above their skull. Part of it is being transparent about the brutality of slavery, about Native American genocide in the United States, and not just in the US, but around the world. When we talk about what happened to Jews during the Holocaust and that combination of religion and ethnicity. Part of the way we atone for this is being upfront about that and implementing policies that can help to correct the racial wealth gap that we know to exist today. So as I end, I want to ask you, how do you plan to become a racial equity advocate? How do you plan to take the research that you do and extend it beyond the ivory tower? See, it's easy to sit inside the ivory tower. It's easy to do that. What's difficult to do is to step outside of the ivory tower and actually make a difference in the lives of the people that you're trying to do. And I think policy is one of the main ways to do it. When I testify on Capitol Hill or in a state legislature, I'm bringing the research I've conducted. I'm being asked to come as an expert to do these sort of things. And I'm highlighting the research that I've done. Not necessarily to always say what should or should not be done, but to say, here are things that you need to think about and why. And this is why it's important to do this from a sociological standpoint. So departments, if you're a department chair, if you're thinking about becoming a department chair, if you're a dean, we need to really think about training our graduate students, even our undergraduate students, to think differently about what they can do with a sociological degree. I think this is particularly important as we think about the mismatch between the number of PhDs being awarded and the actual number of jobs that are available. But also, it's because we have so much to share with the world. And when I'm in these policy spaces, when I'm in Brookings, economists are doing a pretty good job at this. Political scientists are doing a pretty good job at this, but sociologists aren't. So we have to get past this standpoint that some kind of way that doing applied work or doing social justice oriented work means you're not being objective. It means that you're not doing what you're supposed to do. We can actually do both. And we do a disservice to our profession, to the public, and policy that's being implemented when we limit our profession and its ability to make a difference. So thank you for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
You
sir.
bet.
Hi. Thanks, Rashawn. That was awesome. I wish you could see the pile of Post-it notes I have all over the place here as you were talking, because fortunately, I think a lot of what you talked about lines up with some of the things I'm going to talk about in my presidential address. Quick plug for the virtual conference. Go find my talk.
Yeah, I
Um,
can't wait. I can't wait to watch it. It was gonna be like a highlight of what I was doing. I made sure I was like, I gotta make sure that I'm coming in and not leaving when you were giving your lecture.
oh, great pressure. Let me, a couple things came through just as you were talking. I love the idea of objectivity as privilege. I mean, I really think the part of the way we're trained as social scientists is don't let that bias, creep in. So try and be as neutral as you can. That's nice when you look like me. I can pull that off and probably not be affected by the things that I'm studying, and probably get credit for the things that I'm studying, as opposed to being seen as well, you've got a dog in the fight. Let me ask you about the racial equity learner advocate broker idea.
Hmm.
Do you think we need to get maybe one step back to racial self-awareness? Do we need to kind of do some personal inventory? Because I know a lot of folks who are on board with all the things that would check all the liberal boxes. But when you talk to them for any length of time, you start to uncover some stuff that they're still dealing with, and myself included in that. How do we get to the self-awareness to move into the ability to be a good learner, good broker, and a good advocate?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I love how you put that objective privilege, like the ability to be objective. And I mean, you're right, because I mean, some of the spaces that I go into, I don't have the right to, or the privilege to not do that. Like people are like, what are you doing? And how are you aiming to make a difference? And also find whose objectivity, to your point, that we actually take as golden. I think everyone goes into their research that is coming from somewhere.
Right.
I mean, people are just studying social institutions because they don't have a bias toward thinking about things in a particular way. They've been socialized to think about it that way, but only certain outcomes like race or gender do we all of a sudden frame as being that way. I brushed over it slightly when I mentioned racial equity learner. But what you just highlighted, that is couched in that. Part of being a racial equity learner is being reflective and doing, to your point, a personal inventory. Part of doing this personal inventory means I think people can take implicit association tests, be upfront about those. Like for me, when I take the test, I have a weight bias. Like it kind of blows my mind because when I was in grad school, I was 60 pounds heavier than what I was now. Because, as Joyce knows, I mean, in Indiana, I was trying to adjust to just a lot of stuff, gained tons of weight. And then when I lost that weight and I'm super healthy and at least I try to keep up with my kids. Now all of a sudden I have a bias when I see people who I think aren't taking care of their bodies in the way that they should. When instead, I should be one of the main people who should be understanding of that. But instead, I have a bias. So what do I have to do? I have to first know that I have it. First, I have to know I have it. Second, I have to acknowledge that I have it. And then third, I have to put certain types of practices in place to do something about it. So I have a protocol now where when I see somebody who I think is that, I have a process I go through where I say, I don't know what they're going through in their life. They might not have access to healthy food options. They could have some type of health condition. They might not have access to places to exercise. And by doing that, now all of a sudden I make it structural and less personal. I don't blame them. It's more about just something going on. And that's important because when we're in positions of power to hire people, to make decisions on who gets fellowship money, to make decisions on who we're going to hire as RAs and GAs. And if we have that bias toward, in my case, weight, for other people is race or gender, it's going to impact their decision making. So you do that inventory, and then you learn as much about that particular topic as possible, and you learn why you think you have that bias. So I just explained why I think I had that bias. It's because I was privileged enough to be in Indiana that had some of the most amazing pools ever, and I started to swim again, and I lost all my weight. How many people have access to a pool? Like most people where I grew up at, they never even been in a pool. So part of it is highlighting those particular things. And to your point, it's first step is being a racial equity learner, do an inventory with yourself. Be upfront about that with yourself, because that's how we deal with implicit bias. What we found in our work is you deal with implicit bias by being explicit about how the implicit bias operates. And part of it, the colorblind rhetoric has altered how we think about this. Colorblind rhetoric is like out of sight, out of mind. That's not how our minds work. Our minds actually work where we are sorting things so fast implicitly that we don't even know how they're coming together. And oftentimes the explicit bias is just the tip of the iceberg. The implicit bias that's been socialized in us throughout our lives, that have built a collective memory of how we think about the world, just comes out of us every day. So we have to literally debunk and deal with that for an extended period of time. To give the weight analogy, it's kind of like when I get done with this, since of course everybody knows people are quarantined at home, and my wife bakes, she bakes amazing foods, and she baked some cinnamon rolls today. I'm gonna eat one of these cinnamon rolls because like they're amazing. It's gonna take me 5 minutes, 10 minutes to eat this cinnamon roll. It's gonna take me 10 to 15 days to work off that cinnamon roll. And so that is the way that our minds work in regards to race. We have to put it in a continuum, and I don't think we give enough credit to how deeply embedded racism is in our minds.
I think it's a really good point. And we missed a fun opportunity there because if we were in front of the crowd, I'm about 6'3", 380. So to talk about the size difference as having me stand there up there with you would have been fun.
You're tall though, so you you know when you have like 5-6 inches or so, well, that also helps. It helps.
It does.
You're allowed to be heavier when you weigh more, of course.
Tell my doctor that. He doesn't agree. I do have one other question that's kind of related to the COVID-19 stuff. As we were talking in one of my classes remotely, very much like this, the idea of Colin's social density had come up. The idea that in a social isolation situation like this, you're going to be able to, even more than usual, select, like you said, who's around your table.
Yep.
And that we might end up very easily falling into those patterns of seeing the other as dangerous and evil and things like that. How can we deal with that? Hopefully it's a month or two. If it stretches into longer than that, how do we deal with fighting against that urge to fall into the patterns of behavior who you're around every day and self-selecting in your media and things like that?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, and to your point, I hope it's a month or two. But I mean, the way things are going, I mean, like even in New York, I seen that there were tons of people on the subway the other day, and some of them are considered essential now. Like they're having to go to work, and inadvertently, what public transit tried to do, they tried to reduce the number of people or the number of they tried to reduce the schedule. But in turn, what they did was they now loaded up everybody on a condensed schedule. So it's like when policy, it means well and does something else. And then in DC, there were like 100 bikers out riding yesterday. They ride on Sundays, on the weekend. They were just out like it was nothing. And so I think when it comes to who is around our table, to your point, most academics, I mean, we're privileged to be in our house, to be safe, to hopefully be healthy. And, unless people have spouses like me and you do, people are more or less not exposed to what's happening on the front lines.
Right.
I think one of the ways to deal with this is for people to literally take an inventory. I think there are a couple ways to do this. It's similar to what you were saying about being reflective. People should look at a few things. Tells them a lot. They should look at, if they're married, they should look at photos from their wedding. If they get holiday cards, they should look at the racial composition of the people who send them those cards. Mm-hmm. And that is a way to take that inventory. And what that means is, in this moment, is that most people, of course, are reaching out to family. And even though we're seeing racial diversity in families, most people's families is similar to their own race. Sure. But when you make calls to people, think consciously about who you're leaving out of that equation. Who is not included, who you might want to check on, who have very different experiences from you. For example, the number of hate crimes now that's going on for Asians and Asian Americans is extremely high. I actually did a news segment before we did this on this topic where, we're seeing a rise there. And it's not just a rise in hate crimes as it relates to physical violence, but it's also verbal assaults that don't get reported. It's also people not patronizing Asian establishments and restaurants and grocery stores. And these are the ways that people can think consciously about what they're doing. Is to say, okay, who could I patronize? if I'm going to order out, is there a different type of cuisine or a different location that I could choose that might be getting hit harder than other places? So part of it is people who are privileged, not just being laissez-faire about it. Because as we know from Lawrence Bobo's work, that's one of the ways racism proliferates. It's just being laissez-faire about it. For kids, like with my kids, one of the things we're doing is we're writing letters to frontline workers. And it doesn't just include healthcare providers like mommy. It includes grocery store people who bag up our stuff, who, even though they might look like us, they have a very different socioeconomic status than my family does. And so part of it is being conscious of those kind of things. And then what I'm really getting at is socializing other people around you to think the same. See, that's when you really get into the advocacy phase. So when someone says, oh yeah, oh man, that Chinese virus is gonna kill everybody. Whoa, whoa, whoa. No, it's not a Chinese virus. You're not gonna do that. You're not gonna do it around me. You're not gonna cross out Corona or COVID and put Chinese like Trump did. Like, we're not gonna do that. And so part of that, that's part of changing things. And it's being very conscious about people's surroundings and who, to your point, is sitting at your table or sitting at your virtual table.
That's great. Thanks for everything. Again, thanks a lot for agreeing to do this. And I think you gave us all a lot to think about with this as well.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm honored to do it. And, again, I'm extremely honored that you invited me to give the Useem Plenary. I was so excited about it. And, this is a nice way to do it. I felt like that hopefully people will tune into these and check them out. And I look forward to your lecture as well.
I'm looking forward to giving it. Thanks again for coming. Thank you all for listening to the Useem Plenary address at the NCSA 2020 virtual conference.